All right, so you just turned in your projects, and I hope that you remembered to upload the file to MU Online, the Excel file. So before we get into the new material for today, I'm just curious to know how it went on the project and what kinds of assumptions people were making. For example, related to asset growth, where you're going to invest your money. The amount of money that you have at the end of 40 years of saving is hugely affected by a small change in interest rate. For example, if you're assuming that you're going to put all of your life savings into a 1% savings account, when inflation is 2%, then you're actually going to be losing purchasing power over time. So how many of you made some assumption that included the purchase of stocks for your life savings? Very few people were using stocks. I guess that's less than a quarter of the class. So where'd you put the money, if not into the stock market? Because historically, the stock market offers the best return over time. Some people say a historical average of around 7%. Back in the good old days when the economy was growing more, like before the end of the 80s, people were saying that you could count on 11% out of the stock market. But, that included some periods that had pretty high inflation. So where'd you put the money? I'm curious to know. A savings account? You want the security of it? Anybody choose a location other than a savings account? Not stocks, not savings. Gold? And what did you predict for the price appreciation of gold? 5% a year? All right. Anything else? Yeah? Real estate? All right. So in the form of like raw land or a rental house or what? A house? Okay. And what interest rate did you assume for the cumulative growth of that asset? 8.6%. All right. Yeah, that's pretty good. Remember, we were looking, one of the historical price data things that we looked at was the the cost of housing over time. When I was showing you the cost index that was related to consumer prices and construction prices, and so house prices have appreciated quite a bit over time. So that would definitely be a better place to put your money than a savings account. Of course, the housing market can always crash, and so there's that to worry about. There can be a bubble in prices and then the value goes down. But on the other hand, banks can fail as well. And so how many of you looked at your assets during the retirement years? So I asked you, of course, to consider your working years, and I think I said 40 years in the assignment description. But then I also suggested that you should consider how your spending habits may change during retirement. And so if you're spending money during retirement, but you have less income or no income, then theoretically your cumulative assets could be going down over time. Did anybody run out of money before they projected death? Which is a gruesome thing, right? Is that, yeah, if you did this project to the max, what you were supposed to do is you were supposed to look at how much money have you got in the bank on the day that you die. You're going to say, I'll work until I'm 65, and then I'm going to live another 30 years. And so how much money is in the bank versus maybe even debt by the time you die at 95, How much money did you have? $6 million when you're 100 years old. Now, is that unrealistic? What do you think? Is that unrealistic? Okay, now what did you just say? It had a present worth of $1 million. And so what he did was, it seems like a lot of money. It seems like, only a coal company owner or a lottery winner is going to have $6 million, like today, right? It seems like unattainable until you remember that the time value of money is that money is worth less in the future than it is now. So he discounted that to today's terms and found out it's about $1 million. And it's not unrealistic that if you worked for your entire life at saving, of course you could put away $1 million. If you're careful with your expenses, then over the period of 40 years of working, definitely you could save $1 million. So I'm curious to know, what's the oldest anybody went? You did 100 years old. Anybody more optimistic than that? 100? Now what you could do as an optimization activity, now that you've got the spreadsheet, you could change your spending and see how much do you have to keep having your spending going up more and more and more so that you've got zero. Because you don't want to leave anything to your heirs, right? I mean, those brats, they've been mooching off of you when they're young. You do not want to leave them a single penny, so you got to buy a jet, lots of drugs, or football games or something. You got to get some sort of a hobby that's spending a lot, because golf alone isn't going to do it. You know, you got to get some way. I want the last check that I write before I die to bounce. I want them to be like looking around like, who's going to pay this? That's my objective. I don't want to leave a penny for my sons. The first, so yeah, absolutely. Bookend. The first and the last check to bounce. I hope that my sons never hear this recording. But they'll know that something was up when they're reading the will and there's nothing. There's nothing. I spent it all. All right? They get my ashes, I guess. Yeah. No, I'm not leaving anything to anybody. No. All those guys, they bugged me, right? I already know they bugged me. I want to spend it all. I'm a curmudgeon. I don't know. We'll have to see. Maybe I just won't be into any expensive hobbies and then it'll just naturally accumulate. Because I'm not putting my money into, like, savings accounts that pay 1%. I'm always on the hunt for yield, as they call it. You have to be really, these days when the banks are paying so little, you have to be always looking for a good investment opportunity that's also at the same time safe, balancing risk with the potential for income and capital gains. So, well, I'm anxious to look at your reports. I'll be posting the grades over the Thanksgiving break, but I'm also at the same time grading 2 other class projects. And so it may not be Monday that you've got your score posted on the grade book. It may take me till the end of the break or maybe even after the week that we get back. But I'm going to do my best to get that posted soon so you have an idea of what your grade's looking like. Any questions before we move on? How many of you didn't sleep last night? Okay, so there are a couple who just stayed up late. Excellent. I did that a couple of times in college. And I didn't get my highest grades the times that I did that. But if you'd already been working on it and then you stayed up all night because you're polishing it and making it even better, I'm anxious to look at that project. So today what we're going to be talking about is more about cost estimation. Speaking of which, your cost estimation assignment is due the Wednesday after Thanksgiving. So I'll remind you of that again the Monday after Thanksgiving. All right? So indirect cost allocation and activity-based costing. These are both ways of trying to figure out who in an organization is going to deal with indirect costs. So remember that indirect costs are the intangible things that are sometimes difficult to assign to a specific activity. And if we go back to the illustration of making Twinkies in a factory, the indirect costs are the things related to the electricity or the overhead electricity, the lights, the heating in the building. I mean, there's no magic recipe for how much building heat is required for a semi-truck full of Twinkies. But you can know how much sugar is needed, how much plastic is needed, cardboard for the packaging, and so on. So all those indirect costs have to be recovered somehow. You have to assign them to some output that's generating revenue. So they have to be recovered. Now, there's different ways to recover them. In an organization, like a company usually is selling more than one product. Like a foods company may have everything from tomato soup to freeze-dried beef jerky and Twinkies all under the same brand or under the same holding company. And the management of the holding company has to look for ways to assign their expenses to different components of the organization. So if you look at the different types of indirect costs that have to be recovered, for example, taxes. Property taxes are costs that a company or an organization has to pay. And so one way for that organization to decide who in the organization is going to have to pay for the property taxes is they'd look at how much space is being occupied. And so an analogy of that would be the building that we're in right now. There are janitors that come in and clean the building in the night. And so if the university is going to find out whose budget should those cleaning costs come out of. Should it come out of the College of Science? Should it come out of the College of Engineering? Those are the two main users of this building. There are a few other meetings that occasionally get scheduled in here. But one way to figure out who has to pay how much would be to look at the amount of space occupied. And so the square footage in the building, and you'd maybe come up with a percentage of how much of the square footage is occupied by College of Science, how much is occupied by College of Engineering, and then split the indirect costs that way. So each one of these cost categories just gives a few ideas on how you could recover costs. So in the case of utility expenses like heat and light, maybe it's based on space and who's using what space. Or you could even be more specific and count up the number of outlets in each room and who's using that outlet. Or, not listed here, but you could take it a next step further and you could have smart controls on the outlets and be actually measuring the amount of power that's utilized by each organization. Now, it's very uncommon to do that when it comes to organizations recovering their utility costs. But there are some exceptions, and if you think about a lot of companies are giving their employees phones with data plans and a certain number of minutes included, and so the overall bill for a company that they have to pay to Verizon each month, they're going to turn around and pass those expenses on to the sub-organizations within the company. And so it would be on the basis of maybe data used or minutes spent and things of that nature. So there's receiving and purchasing expenses, and so you could allocate that based on the number of orders or the number of items. There's just a whole long list. And so to get some practice with that, I've created an in-class exercise where you are going to figure out where the indirect costs should be allocated for a construction company. Now, this construction company has some affiliates, and is the chair missing over there? Have you got a chair? Huh? Here, there's one here. We can shuffle them down. All right. So, all right, so we have 3 affiliates, and what's listed there is a summary of their operations, like the excavation company. We know that they've got a certain number of employees. The steel assembly affiliate is a much larger organization. They have more employees. But if you look at it, the revenue that they're earning is not proportional to the number of employees that they have. So it would be unfair, for example, to try and recover all the indirect costs. The company as a whole has $6.95 million of indirect costs that they have to somehow figure out who's paying it. The holding company that has these 3 subgroups. And that $6.95 million may include payroll, taxes, vehicles, and everything else. All of their indirect costs that have to be recovered. So I've told you in these various steps what formula is going to be used to pass along those expenses to the customer. Because the one thing you don't want to do is in accounting for your direct costs and your indirect costs, cover them all yourselves, not pass them along, and then end up going out of business because you didn't collect enough revenue. So the idea behind this in-class exercise is how much extra charges should be passed along to the customer to cover the indirect costs. So I don't know if you've ever taken a package to the UPS facility before, but when you go there, they have actually two different prices two different components of the price. There's the regular amount that you have to pay for shipping, and then they collect a little bit extra as a fuel surcharge. Most people don't even look at the itemized bill, but they're passing along an additional expense that they have to pay because I guess several years ago, back when gas prices were high, they were really getting killed because of the fuel prices. Of course, most of the people who are collecting fuel surcharges didn't eliminate them when gas prices went low again. They've continued to charge them. So that's just an illustration of like a pass-along charge. So here, you're going to be figuring out the pass-along charges for each of these three organizations, the excavation company, the steel assembly affiliate, and the surveying division. Here's what you have to do for Part A. Proportion means that they're not going to all pay the same amount to the parent company. You know, the parent company says that they need to gather $6.95 million to cover indirect costs. Well, what if they divided that by 3? Obviously, that wouldn't be fair because the excavation company is earning so much more revenue than the surveying division. So the first part of this example, Part A, is saying, what if you base the indirect cost allocations on a proportion of revenue? So the excavation company earned $13.597 million out of $17.547 million. And so if you multiply that proportion by the overall amount that has to be recovered, then it tells you how much indirect cost recovery is going to be allocated to the excavation company, and so on. So the key word in understanding that problem is just interpreting what is meant by proportion. Now, in Part B, we're going to take these amounts and figure out how are those three divisions going to pass it along to their customers. You know, in Part B, we're talking about the excavation company. So here's the amount the excavation company has to give to the holding company, which is kind of like the main organization above it. So they're going to try and get this $5.3 million from their customers. And what Part B says is, if they are recovering it from their customers on the basis of volume excavated, and we know that they excavated 180,000 cubic meters, then how many dollars per cubic meter should they add as a surcharge to their customers? So if you look at the units there, it will give you a clue on what to do. Okay, on Part D, for the surveying division, I'm asking you to calculate a factor, meaning like a fraction or a percentage, in order to recover the indirect costs. And so what I mean by that is what's inside the brackets here are the direct costs. And you can think of the base revenue as their direct costs. And if you add the base revenue together with the amount that they have to collect for their indirect costs, which is $554,511, so you put that total amount on the left-hand side, then you'll be able to calculate F sub I. F sub I is the indirect cost factor. So in other words, 1 plus some F value, an indirect cost factor, is going to be the direct costs, which we know is $1.4 million. That's how much they get from their customers each year, plus $1.4 million plus the amount they have to give to the parent company, which is $554,511. So what is the factor that they should recover for every dollar of direct costs they charge their customers? just to summarize, the holding company has three divisions. The holding company has an excavation division, a steel assembly affiliate, and a surveying division. And so this holding company has $6.95 million of indirect costs it has to cover. So it passes those indirect costs on to its subsidiaries, and then those subsidiaries pass the costs on to their customers. So what we first calculated in Part A is how much do the subsidiary companies have to pay up the chain to the main holding company. So we calculated each of those amounts, and the basis of that allocation was on their revenue. And then, on that same amount that they're passing up the chain, they have to get it from somewhere. So they get it from their customers. And in the case of the excavation company, we can see that they charge an additional $29.92 per cubic meter excavated for the indirect costs. Now that will be in addition to the costs that they have to get from their base revenue. So we could have calculated how many dollars per cubic meter it is for their base revenue by having the $13.59 million divided by 180,000. And that would have represented the base cost to their customers, and this is in addition to it. So the same kind of an idea for steel assembly affiliate. They're doing it per meter of reinforcing steel that's assembled. And then the surveying division, because what they do is kind of a service without like a physical output that can be measured quite as easily. You know, it's not about something that they're going out into the field and building. It's surveying, which is taking measurements and identifying the lengths of things and areas and where borders are and so on. And so it can't be related to something physical, and that's why instead it's kind of more just an abstract factor. So when they bid a job, when they go out and do an estimate and they figure how much they're going to charge for their base services, then they would add 39.6% on top of how much they're going to charge the client so that they can pass that up the chain to cover the indirect costs. All right, so the purpose of that example is just to acquaint you with the ideas behind indirect cost allocation. Are there any questions related to that before we move on? All right, well, the next component of today's class is called activity-based costing. And we're going to begin with a couple of definitions. The terminology here is a little unusual, and so we have to make sure we're all on the same page before we start the calculations. A cost center is the final products or services of a company, meaning its outputs, the things that it does. And the outputs that it's generating are going to receive indirect costs, meaning that if you're selling something as the output of your company, if you're selling Twinkies, even though the amount of sugar, flour, and plastic in a Twinkie costs 2 cents, part of the reason why they charge more than 2 cents for a Twinkie is because they have to cover a lot of other expenses besides those direct costs. And so maybe they're charging 25 cents per Twinkie. A lot of people have heard that soda from a fountain is really, really inexpensive, right? You pay $1.39 at a restaurant for a glass of soda, and there's maybe 1 cent worth of flavoring and sugar in there. And the water is so inexpensive it's not worth even mentioning. So it's like their direct cost is 1 cent, but they have a lot of other indirect costs because, you know, the sugar and the flavoring that goes into your soda doesn't account for the machine itself. It doesn't account for the transportation of the syrup and the flavoring. It doesn't account for the electricity in the building. I mean, it's not like you're getting that soda from a street corner. You're buying it from a building that pays property taxes and employee salary, wages, and so there's a lot of indirect costs that have to be allocated there. So what we're saying is that the soda you buy in a restaurant is a cost center. It's just a weird name for it, but let's say that we're going to call the products or services the cost center. And so the cost center receives the indirect cost so that it can be passed along to the consumer. The activities are the things that are generating the indirect costs. And so the activity in the case of soda at a restaurant, the activities would be filling up the ice machine. The activities would be having lights for the building. The activities would be transportation of the syrup from the factory to the restaurant. So there's all of these auxiliary things that are piling on the indirect costs. And so these activities generate the indirect costs. And so what you need to remember for the final exam, for example, is who receives indirect costs and who generates them, who or what. And so these indirect costs, we all know what they are. If I asked you to define indirect costs, I'm sure you do a great job explaining what they are. But then you also need to go one step further and remember who the indirect costs come from and where do they go to. The cost drivers are the things that help to quantify the magnitude of the indirect costs, so the volumes. So take, for instance, in the case of the sugar water at a restaurant, the number of cups that they sell. Well, one way they keep track of how much soda is actually being consumed is from the number of cups that they have going out of the restaurant. And so I've been to a few restaurants before where, like, if you wanted water, they had to give you a separate water cup. Like it's like a clear plastic cup. And part of the reason for that is because they want to make sure that you're not filling up the cup with Coke, you know. So it makes it a little harder to get away with stealing. But that's not the only reason. Part of the other reason is that they do their accounting on the basis of how many of the normal, ordinary cups went out of the store, because they don't want the employees just giving away free soda. And so they do an inventory control on the number of cups that went in and went out of the restaurant, and it should match up with the register receipts. And so here the cost drivers are, there's lots of different things we can keep track of to help drive the consumption of the resource that's shared. So this is all about cost estimation. So let's think about, what if there's a college, a certain hypothetical college out there that offers 3 majors? Let's say that there's an engineering program, a safety technology program, and a computer science program. And there's a certain number of faculty members in each of these programs, a certain number of students, and so on. Now, every campus has an IT department, and they're always given way too much power. They charge way too much, and it's sort of like extortion in a lot of ways. And you can quote me on that. So this organization that's just always getting bigger and always want more and more money, we have to sort of figure out how we're going to pay that bill. So let's say that the IT department on campus wants $145,000 from us. Now, these 3 different majors in the college are not going to they're going to want to minimize how much money they have to chip in out of their own budget to cover this IT expense. And so, for example, the engineering division, which has lots of students and a pretty high number of computers, they're going to try and look for creative ways to make their contribution lower. They're going to say, well, let's just divide it by 3, right? That's like when you go to a restaurant with a guy who orders drinks, appetizers, dessert, and then when the bill comes, he says, oh, let's just split it 2 ways, right? And you had maybe like a side salad, okay? Same idea here. There's different ways of looking at it. You can look at it on the basis of how many computers there are in each department, on the basis of how many support calls are being made, and so on. So what I'd like you to do is figure out how much is each of these 3 divisions going to have to pay based on Part A, the number of support calls, and Part B, the number of computers, and then not listed on the screen there, but there is a Part C, so you'll have to write it onto your paper. The last thing I want to know about is, what if we did it on the basis of the number of students? So write that on your paper, Part C, number of students. IT departments always want more money, and they also offer terrible service. So when you quote me, be sure and mention that I said that they offer terrible service. All right? I want to alienate as many people as possible. So let's say that these three organizations have a big powwow meeting. You know, the department chair of safety, engineering, and computer science, they get together for a meeting because they have to decide who's going to pay the $145,000. What argument is the safety chair going to make? Like, what is going to be his opinion based on, how is he going to say, well, we should divide it up this way? What do you think? Let's see, the safety division is going to say, well, we only have a small number of computers. We've only got 20, so I think we should allocate the cost on the basis of the computers. And who is that going to make mad? That is going to make the computer science mad. They're going to say, well, sure, we've got a lot of computers, but we're not dummies. We're hardly ever having these calls. If you look, we only have 2 calls a week, even though we've got double the number of computers, so why should we have to pay so much? And so it's going to go around and around. Everyone's going to have their own opinion on how it should be allocated. And so maybe a further analysis would be needed to find out, of that $145,000, what is it actually going to? So for example, a Wi-Fi router. See this one up on the ceiling? We had one put up in the other building, the engineering lab building, a few years ago. And has anybody here bought a Wi-Fi router before? How much is a Wi-Fi router? $50, $30? If you buy in bulk, you think maybe like $20, right? No, $2,000. Yeah, $2,000 to have it installed. So yeah, it's really expensive. So you got to sort of figure out why are the costs so high, and figure out then where to pass it to. So, all right, so let's revisit these announcements here. You've got very little on your plate at this point. You've got it all done. You should be breathing a sigh of relief as you head towards massive quantities of pie and turkey. So enjoy it, and I'll see you back on Monday after the break.